Chapter 2. The Trail into Darkness. John couldn't help it. He wasn't going to sit still any longer. There wasn't even the sound of police sirens yet. He saw the black SUV tear down the streets of El Paso with Martinez Jewelers completely shattered, display cases emptied, and a loud alarm ringing through the early morning. John sprinted to his F-150, quickly put it in gear, and caught up to the black getaway SUV at a safe distance. John kept his headlights off. It was still dark enough that he blended into the shadows. He followed the SUV up the I-10, heading west. They weren't speeding, but they also weren't going slow. They maintained a pace of 75 miles per hour. Clever, he thought. Speeding would make them stand out. He stayed a few car lengths behind. This wasn't the first time he'd tailed criminals, but it still got his heart racing. It reminded him that he was still alive. His mind was already working ahead, running mock scenarios, trying to predict their next move. Years of experience had sharpened his instincts, and those instincts told him these guys weren't headed for a random hideout. They had a plan. The SUV exited the highway onto a small two-lane road that stretched out into the desert just beyond the city limits. Nothing out here except a few cheap motels known more as halfway houses for prisoners who just got released, junkies, or the occasional couple sneaking off to have an affair just outside of town. It didn't take long for the SUV to pull off the main road and turn into the parking lot of a rundown motel. The neon sign flickered weakly, proclaiming Sunrise Inn in bright orange letters, with the R light bulb out. Definitely 5 stars. John parked his truck on the side of the road, just out of sight, and killed the engine. The motel looked like any other dingy roadside stop, but John knew better. The building walls were worn and faded, and a couple of windows were boarded up, but the parking lot had a surprising number of all-black SUVs parked in the back. A little too nice and uniform for a place like this. He sat in his truck for a moment, watching. The SUV rolled to a stop near the side entrance of the motel. The 5 Venezuelan gang members got out, moving swiftly with their duffel bags of loot slung over their shoulders. They didn't waste time, no standing around, no talking. John could see their leader from earlier, the tall one with the golden revolver, gesturing toward the entrance with the same cold efficiency he'd shown at the jewelry store. They disappeared inside the building, leaving John alone in the parking lot. He exhaled slowly, weighing his next move. This wasn't just some low-level gang of smash-and-grab thieves. They were organized and intelligent, and they had resources. And this motel was no ordinary hideout. John had heard rumors during his time as sheriff. Whispers about specific places on the outskirts of town that operated under the guise of legitimate businesses, but were fronts for criminal enterprises. Drugs, weapons, human trafficking, everything ugly that El Paso's underbelly had to offer. He never could pin anything down back then and never had the evidence. But now, here it was, staring him right in the face. He pulled his phone from his pocket and snapped pictures of the SUVs in the building. His first instinct was to call someone. Old friends on the force, maybe? But what would he tell them? That he'd gone rogue and followed a dangerous Venezuelan gang alone? He could already see them shaking their heads on the other end of the line. Why was he putting his life in danger instead of enjoying early retirement? So he needed something more. Some concrete evidence he could pass along. John grabbed his Glock 17 from the center console of his truck, popped in the magazine, tucked the gun in his waistband, and grabbed his favorite brown Stetson cowboy hat resting on the passenger seat. He put his hat on and jumped out of his truck, leaving the door slightly ajar to slip back in if he needed to make a quick getaway. The desert air was still, and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic from the highway. He made his way toward the motel, keeping low, sticking to the shadows, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He pulled his hat down a little to cover his face. He approached the back of the building, where the alley behind the motel led to a service entrance. From here, he had a clear view of the side entrance the gang had used. John opened the door slowly, just enough to peer in and get an idea of the situation inside. He was careful not to make a sound. He caught a glimpse of movement inside through the gap in the door. A heavy-set man with tattoos creeping up his neck sat by a counter, talking to one of the gang members. He was counting money on multiple cash counting machines. The motel lobby had desks stacked with cash and a few monitors showing security camera feeds. Fortunately, no one was currently viewing them. John snapped a quick photo on his phone ensuring the sound was turned off. He heard the faint sound of Spanish chatter echoing through the hall. John focused on the interior and quickly realized it was more than a hideout. It was a base for a much more sophisticated criminal enterprise. And now the gang was bringing their stolen goods to this spot, probably to resell online or in pawn shops across the US or trade for arms or drugs with other gangs. His breath slowed as he focused, listening to the conversation inside. One word caught his attention:
Entrega.
delivery. They were talking about more than just the jewelry heist. Something else was coming in, something bigger than $3 million worth of jewelry. John wondered what the delivery could be. Fentanyl, ARs, human cargo. John was trying to piece it all together. This wasn't just a one-off job. They were running something more elaborate and dangerous. Whatever it was happening soon. John had enough to go on, but just as he started to make his way out of there, the sharp click of a gun's hammer and the cold barrel of a gun pressed against his head stopped him in his tracks.
What the fuck do you think you're doing, old man?
A gruff voice with a Venezuelan accent said from behind him. The man with the Venezuelan accent commanded,
Take the gun out of your waistband, slowly, and drop it on the ground. Then turn around or I'll blow your fucking head off.
John dropped his gun on the dirt ground and raised his hands slowly while turning around. It was the gang leader. And now the golden revolver was pressed against his head. This was not a good situation. John hadn't been as careful as he thought. Now, he was in the thick of it, unarmed, and at the mercy of a man who wouldn't think twice about putting a bullet in him. His eyes stared down at the barrel of the gun pointed at his head, held by the leader, the massive, overweight man. The gang leader was no longer masked, and his eyes were cold and calculating, and he had a deep scar, probably from a knife wound, on the left side of his face. He had a shaved head, patchy facial hair, and a goatee that wasn't fully grown. He smelled of cigarettes and body odor, and John could hear him breathing loudly. The breathing heavy people do involuntarily. John also couldn't help but notice that the golden revolver was a beautiful gun. It was too flashy for his taste, but very impressive. John's voice was calm. No need for trouble. I was just looking for a room for the night. This place looked open, but he knew it was too late for that.